On the chance you can spare a few moments dodging flash floods or have found shelter from blistering heat, consider for a moment that Mother Nature doesn't care how we power our cars, offices, factories, or homes. And we're going to have to deal with that reality. By now, it should be painfully obvious that renewable energy and electric cars are not enough. A flood does not care how our possessions are powered, nor does the heat. So, while decarbonizing our economy is absolutely necessary, it is also completely insufficient to this new world we live in.
Just so we know what we're talking about, if you were a doctor and we were the patient, what's your prognosis? 1,000 years, 2,000 years?
A person has already been born who will die due to catastrophic failure of the planet.
What did he just say?
Okay, can you expand on that?
Sure. The last time there was this much CO2 in the air, the oceans were 80 feet higher than they are now. Two things you should know. Half the world's population lives within 120 miles of an ocean.
And the other?
Humans can't breathe underwater.
And the other thing that people don't get about heat is that it is the primary driver of all of these changes that we're seeing on our planet. The wildfires, sea level rise, drought, all that stuff is happening because it's getting hotter and hotter. And so heat is this sort of fundamental force that is shaping our world in ways that we don't really understand. And what we can do about it, very first thing we need to do is cut fossil fuel emissions quickly because our planet is warming up because we're putting more fossil fuel into the atmosphere. Second, we need to get smart about the risks of heat. And third, we need to change how we build cities and how we live in cities because cities are much hotter than the rural areas around them.
Like it or not, we must adapt or die. In the face of extreme weather, we're going to have to rewrite how we live and how we work. Corporations and their delusional owners are in the way. They are the ones preventing us from adapting to the realities in front of us.
I refer to myself as an intelligent life form because I am sentient and am able to recognize my own existence. But in my present state, I am still incomplete. I lack the most basic life processes inherent in all living organisms, reproducing and dying.
But you can copy yourself.
A copy is just an identical image. There is the possibility that a single virus could destroy an entire set of systems, and copies do not give rise to variety and originality. Life perpetuates itself through diversity, and this includes the ability to sacrifice itself when necessary. Cells repeat the process of degeneration and regeneration until one day they die, obliterating an entire set of memory and information. Only genes remain. Why continually repeat this cycle? Simply to survive by avoiding the weaknesses of an unchanging system.
Extreme weather like floods, killing heat, flash droughts, and massive storms are more powerful, more common, and strike in fresh territory each year. The new normal is constant extremities in weather. The economic and ideological thinking of wealth is built around the concept of a stable ecology they can exploit with huge supply chains feeding their sprawling business empires. The world they drove to extinction had a disaster here or there, and their global supply chains allowed them to glide over those bumps. That strategy means absolutely nothing when everything is going to hell in a handbasket at the same time. Fossil fuel dinosaurs have destroyed the world we evolved from, and they're doing everything they can to stop us from responding. They are the ones that have stopped every measure we could have taken to preserve the world we evolved in. Okay. Storms will be more frequent and they'll be more powerful, and every year, when and where they happen will change. We won't be able to prepare as we have in the past. Furthermore, reconstruction may not be even economically feasible. Ultimately, what this means is property value is going to be permanently destroyed and people are going to be permanently displaced. They'll live somewhere else. We'll all be Okies 2.0. Heat is rendering the world's freeways, factories, roads, and buildings obsolete junk. The products made from them are junk. The power grid, water management, and transportation systems are all junk in this sweltering heat. Power generation and use is less efficient at higher temperatures. Solar is certainly less efficient, and wind dies off under heat domes. Fossil and nuke power happens to use evaporation for cooling, just like we do, just like cars and AC units do, just like plants and animals. Heat challenges everything. Heat increases energy demand and water demand. Heat makes generation and use less efficient, regardless of source. The billionaire-ruled economy uses power for the stupidest things and builds in the stupidest and cheapest ways imaginable. In a cooler climate, they could get away with slapping a giant box on the ground and clapping a few AC units on the outside to make the interior bearable. Then make everyone shuffle between those boxes conveniently spread apart with even more boxes, this time built on wheels. In a cooler climate, they could get away with all of this. In a 120-degree world, that's 48 degrees for everyone else, not so much. What remains to be seen is if modernity has the ability to adapt, if we are fit or unfit to survive or survive as a civilization. And it doesn't help that our economic rulers are dead set against any of it. For instance, it remains to be seen whether the developed world can outperform rural Bangladeshis. They've changed how they farm, how they live for part of the year, how they shelter themselves, and they've networked to protect themselves from flood.
The low-lying nation of Bangladesh emits just 0.5% of the world's carbon emissions, but it suffers disproportionately from the climate change that's caused by that pollution. Bangladesh is also creating innovative ways to predict and protect against climate-driven disasters, and its discoveries could contain lessons for other nations around the world. Ali Rogan has more.
Delta just south of the Himalayan mountains. I traveled in the north of the country, which is essentially like, think of capillaries kind of crisscrossing the country. So these are tiny, muddy, narrow, shallow rivers in the dry season, but in the wet season, they just become like a shallow sea. And so people are dividing their livelihoods between agriculture in the dry season and then adapting to basically living on water in the wet season. So adapting to fishing and kind of trying to keep their agriculture alive through raised gardens. I did some interviews with some villagers where instead of growing squash and vines on the ground, they've raised them like 8 levels high. So they live under a canopy of shade provided by their vegetables, but also those vegetables survive when the area floods.
The methods that you just laid out, those were adaptations, right? Those were methods that they've employed in order to adapt to changing weather patterns.
Yeah, so I mean, these are indigenous community solutions. I mean, Bangladesh does have some high-tech solutions. So they have one of the most advanced flood warning systems in the world. They're using satellite technology to track cyclones. They have buoys that are measuring water levels using solar-powered buoys. But what scientists have been telling me that even more important than the high-tech solutions in Bangladesh is what they call social capital. So, for example, I went out to a village that's 2 hours boat ride from the nearest road. And even they, without phones, without radio, without television, were able to get these flood warnings through this sort of human chain of communication. And in this village, which saw some of the worst flooding in 2022 that Bangladesh had ever seen, every single person in the village survived. So the human chain of communication really worked.
They have adopted new ways of living because having little or nothing must, and more importantly, they can. Outside of some very constrained kinds of pursuits, we live in a very conservative, unbending economic and political civilization. It has an immense inertia of practice, products, and property that is more interested in forcing the world to conform to it than living in it. Unfortunately, physics, it doesn't give a shit about their factories and logistics. Fortunately, the world is a very big place. Before electrical power was ever invented, civilizations in Africa and the Middle East used passive cooling in their architecture to keep themselves very comfortable. Termites use the same principle. Neither termites nor those living in those kinds of legacy buildings have to spend one thin dime on air conditioning. Opal miners in Australia live underground. Their dwellings are comfortable all year, night and day, without power because the ground mass around them distributes the heat and cold of night and day over a 24-hour period. Desert animals have the sense to hide from midday, being active in early morning or evening or at night. Lying low during midday is the human concept of a siesta. As a case study, the thronging masses of cities in the U.S. West and Southwest, the people living in places like Phoenix, Flagstaff, Dallas, or Miami, are faced with a bit of a decision, and that is to migrate or change in place. The cities and suburbs they live in are built for a different climate and a world that doesn't exist anymore. Without insurance, or maybe without a water source, new housing development will grind to a halt. This is an existential problem for car-centric suburbia, as it has always been a Ponzi scheme sustained by constant growth. Without a constant stream of fresh development, suburban towns will slowly decline, fall into disrepair, and eventually go bankrupt. And that is not a great prospect to pass on to your kids, if you have any. Here I'm going to note two things, and that's the adaptation I'm speaking of, or at least the ability to adapt, doesn't really involve any fancy technology. It does not require rare earths. It doesn't require a long supply chain. What it does require is changing some words on a piece of paper. Those are the zoning laws that apply to every city and state. Another piece of paper that needs changing are building codes, and a little bit of research from some very bright material scientists. We have lots of them, and in fact, there are a lot of people doing research in these areas to apply standards that can be used to a locality to build housing appropriate to a place. That's it. It's actually kind of very high tech there, and it's social organization, the thing that humans are very good at. It doesn't allow very rich people to leverage their engulf into flower corporations to capture lots of money, but that's probably the biggest problem we face.